Around the world, one of nature's greatest wonders, coral reefs are turning white and dying.
We're talking about 33 years away. 33 years till the mass destruction of an entire ecosystem.
Makes me feel angry because we knew this was coming. We knew it for years.
But could there be a way to save our reefs? I'm a marine biologist, and I'm setting out to meet the scientists who say they can. They're embarking on radical new experiments, breeding super corals to withstand warming oceans. But it's risky.
Can we intervene without making things worse?
They could breed a monster coral that takes over the reef.
The failure for us to intervene now will be the loss of the world's coral reefs.
It's just really hard to know when to essentially start playing God.
It's daring science. Can it save the reef? This is Port Douglas in far north Queensland. It's the epicentre of a disaster that's threatening the Great Barrier Reef.
Emma,
Good to see you.
good morning and welcome aboard.
I'm Emma Johnston. I'm a professor of marine ecology at the University of New South Wales. Everything on board?
Yes.
And I'm on the board of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the agency that makes the rules that protect the reef. My job is to advise the board on how to do that in the face of unrelenting change. The stakes are huge and time is running out. I have to know the latest science and decide if it has any chance to save the reef. I'll meet two scientists, half a world apart, working together to fast-track the evolution of corals. Ruth Gates in Hawaii is conditioning and breeding supercorals that can withstand a hotter future.
If the coral doesn't survive, the reef will not survive.
Madeline Van Oppen on the Queensland coast is creating new, super tough species of coral.
I think we should try all that is within our power.
I want to understand what they're doing and if their experiments could work on the Great Barrier Reef. But first, I'm heading out with John Rumney, who's been diving the reef for 40 years. I want to see what's happened after 2 years of record high ocean temperatures.
Well, you know, we're right here on the Outer Barrier Reef, and this is one of those absolutely fantastic spots. We'll go in here and we'll have a great yardstick of the impacts that we're seeing right now.
I do think it's one thing to hear about the bleaching through the news or to be reading about it in scientific papers, and it's another thing entirely to witness it with your own eyes. And I'm actually feeling quite confronted about jumping in and seeing that.
Coral, very white, and in fact some of the algae started to grow over it.
I see whole fields of dead coral, the white skeletons sticking up. Bleaching caused by an ocean that's become too warm. Brown algae is already spreading over it, the first step in the disintegration of the reef.
Here was completely covered in algae and it's starting to disintegrate. And then down here, Sea rubble. Traffic left, straight left.
We know of no global bleaching events until the 1980s. And now there have been 4. The ocean is continuing to warm. That means bleaching events like this will happen more often.
Swimming over this reef has been so badly damaged by 2 consecutive bleaching events. Now it's making me feel a little helpless. But mostly it makes me feel angry because we knew this was coming. We've known for years.
So that was a fascinating dive. The disturbingly half-dead, half-alive reef. It was grotesque in some senses because the colours were wrong. The colours were all wrong, different to how a reef should look. Felt most like I was watching an animal die. That was the most confronting part. That and the scale.
The damage to this reef is shocking. But to truly understand the scale of the problem, I need to get up high. I've come to Townsville to meet Professor Terry Hughes from the Australian Research Council's Centre for Coral Reef Studies. Terry conducts aerial surveys of the Great Barrier Reef. His team of scientists assess what's happening over its immense length.
It takes us about 7 or 8 days of flying to crisscross the whole Barrier Reef. Last year, in the northern 700-kilometre stretch of the Barrier Reef, roughly from Port Douglas all the way up to New Guinea, we saw an average loss of corals of 67%. That was catastrophic, and tragically we've now had bleaching again this year.
So that's 2/3 of the corals are dying.
It's not a question of the corals are dying. Corals did die. The bleaching is incredibly conspicuous.
Stark white coral heads punctuate the dull brown of a damaged reef.
We're not going to be able to maintain the reefs in the condition that they're currently in or that they were in 30 years ago. That's simply not possible. Reefs like the Great Barrier Reef will be so degraded they'll be unrecognisable.
If this is happening to the entire reef, I can't help but wonder what it will mean for the ocean and for us. I was 20 when I first dived on the reef, and I loved it. I was blown away. I thought, here is a place that is so alien, so complex, and so very beautiful. The Great Barrier Reef is the largest reef system in the world. Its waters pulse with life. From the fish that find food in the currents or graze on plants and coral, to the hunters that pursue them. And there is abundance like few places on Earth. Around 1/3 of all Australian fish spend at least some time on the Great Barrier Reef. But the reef also directly affects us. It protects our coastline from the power of storm-driven waves. And it's a tourist mecca worth nearly $30 billion. The vast majority of scientists agree that burning fossil fuels is warming the planet, especially our oceans. And the effect on coral reefs is dramatic.
Fundamentally, to keep this reef in a pristine state is impossible right now. We've had 2 years of consecutive bleaching. All the predictions are that bleaching may become a fact of life if we don't cut back carbon emissions. Given how slow the world is moving on carbon emissions, this means that we are going to lose these reefs as they are now, and that the question then becomes, do we just let that happen? Do we just see what survives? Or do we use science to try and create corals that can survive some of these heat stress periods?
The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has to decide how to face a future that's changing faster than any of us anticipated. Here in Townsville, I'm meeting with the authority's chairman, Russell Reichelt.
Hi, Russell.
Hello, Emma.
To discuss how we'll face this unfolding disaster.
Well, as you can see in this beautiful education centre, this is a microcosm of this giant marine park we've been managing for nearly over 40 years, which we did by protecting it from people's impacts, fishing, too much shipping, too much tourism, get out of nature's way, let it fix itself after storms and things. But, you know, the threats now with the bleaching, we have to change how we do business in the marine park.
Scientists are trying to change the biology of corals to survive warming oceans. And we, on the board, have to consider the risks.
At the moment, a lot of scientists are trialling different techniques, but they could not, according to the rules, really try it out on the reef.
The best minds from Australia here, the Institute of Marine Science, and the people from Hawaii are working on this.
What are our options? What's on the table?
Everything is on the table. Leave no stone unturned. Is there some way that we can encourage the growth of tolerant strains of corals that are probably out there on the Barrier Reef now? Can they give the reef time and retain its structure and build its resilience for the long term?
So really you're looking at anything that could help corals grow back after a bleaching event and also prevent them bleaching in the first place?
Yes. We have a policy challenge to keep up with the speed of the need for change, and I think the science community will have to step up the understanding of these things. So we really have to work together to do that, but we do need it kind of now, and so we need to have experiments working in the lab as soon as possible, trials in the field that will do no harm in the field as soon as possible.
This is huge. It's the first time the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority is willing to directly intervene by creating new corals to withstand a warming world. It's a big step because central to our mission is the imperative to do no harm. And the history of intervening is filled with disaster. The cane toad is an infamous example. In 1935, 102 toads were released in Australia to eat the beetles that damage highly lucrative sugarcane. But instead of eating the beetles, they ate everything else. They've spread across Australia, devastating the populations of native animals that try to eat the poisonous toads. Trying to control the ecology of a complex system isn't simple. So, if we're going to try to save the reef, we need to know more about coral itself. What is coral? From a distance, it looks like mossy rock or bone. Up close, it appears to be covered in tiny flowers. But each of those flowers are actually an animal, a coral polyp. A round body topped with a mouth surrounded by a ring of tentacles. Inside, there is a simple gut lined with long threads of tissue that help digest the coral's food. Reef-building corals lay down a skeleton of calcium carbonate, essentially rock. Corals are colonial, budding off new polyps, each one connected to the one next to it, and genetically identical, forming a living veneer. Corals are hunters. Their tentacles are lined with millions of stinging cells that kill what they catch. They are super weapons on a micro scale. But in the clear, warm water where corals live, there's not much to catch. So, how do corals find food? The secret to their success is in their relationship with a plant. Living right inside their cells are tiny algae, plant cells known as symbionts. Like all plants, they photosynthesize. Using energy from the sun, they produce sugars, enough food for themselves and for their coral host. It's extraordinary biology, an almost alien relationship where the algae gets a home and the coral gets up to 90% of its food. And together, they build the reef. But because of warming oceans, there's been a massive breakdown in this crucial relationship. And the reef as we know it is disappearing. Fast. If science can help the reef survive, the answer may lay halfway around the world. On a tiny Hawaiian island, scientists are trying to understand the connection between coral and the plant inside them, and use that knowledge to speed up evolution.
I'm at the Hawaiian Institute of Marine Biology, where Ruth Gates does her research. It's an ideal facility. Over here, you can grow corals, and over here, you can grow hammerhead sharks. But what's really amazing is that we are right on a coral reef.
Dr. Ruth Gates has been studying corals for over 25 years, inspired by a love of the reef.
The coral reef is a vibrant natural city. It's got texture, it's got color, it's got movement. You're surrounded by extraordinary things.
Ruth and her team are investigating the mechanism of coral bleaching. What happens when temperatures get too high for coral?
Hi.
Great to see you.
Welcome.
Beautiful lab.
Welcome.
This special microscope lets Ruth and biologist Amy Eggers raise the water temperature to simulate warming oceans and observe what happens to living coral as it bleaches.
This is the only microscope in the world that's equipped to simulate future ocean conditions that allows you to visualize a living organism.
So you can really see how it's a colonial animal here, can't you? All of those polyps.
The number of algal cells, or symbionts, living throughout the coral is staggering. Around 1 million in every square centimetre, an area the size of your thumbnail. Coral builds the reef structure that supports so much other life, so it's called a foundation species.
If coral is a foundation species, then the symbionts themselves are clearly a keystone species because the coral cannot survive without them, And if the coral doesn't survive, the reef will not survive.
When ocean temperatures get too high, the coral rejects the algae living inside it in the process called bleaching.
Coral bleaching is really the breakdown of this relationship between these plant cells and the animal itself.
The plant cells react to high temperature, and instead of creating food, they produce an irritant to the coral.
When the animal gets stressed, somehow they break the connection and the plant cells are ousted from the system.
Some corals belch clouds of their life-giving algal cells. Others release them over days in tiny clumps.
What you see as the coral goes pale is just the clear tissues of the animal overlaying the white skeleton.
Bleached but still living coral can clearly be seen under powerful magnification. It's become a ghost coral, hasn't it? Like, you know, all the structure is still there, but none of the colour, none of the vibrancy.
Yeah.
That is a spooky image. Without its algae, coral can live for a short time, but eventually it will starve and die. Ruth uses another tool, laser light, for an extraordinary new view of the complex relationship between plant and animal.
Basically, it's under UV light, and what you're seeing, the red, are the symbionts.
Under the laser's UV light, we can clearly see what happens when the red algal cells are expelled. The bleaching coral gradually appears black.
You can see the mesentery, see it's completely clear.
This coral looks like it's bleaching by expelling its mesentery, its stomach, full of algal cells, the red dots.
And you can see the mesentery coming out of the mouth and full of symbionts.
So that's a bizarre response to stress. Why is it throwing out its guts?
It seems to be an expression of discontent. The microalgae that are being released because they're now toxic to the animal. They've become somehow foe, and they push those algae out of the system.
This is coral behaviour under stress that's never been seen before. One thing is clear from what Ruth and Amy have shown me. We still have a lot to learn about how coral reacts to stress. In other circumstances, I'd be so excited to be here. An island surrounded by a tropical reef, devoted to marine biology, but to tell you the truth, I'm a little overwhelmed. Spent the whole day looking at images, really detailed, beautiful images, but of corals at a very dark moment in their life, corals that are in the process of expelling their life-giving symbionts, and the complexity of it was really what was overwhelming.
Morning. How you doing, Sean? Hi. This is Emma.
The end product of our work are ways in which we can assist corals to face a future that is warmer and more acidic and survive it. That is really the challenge.
The reefs of Kanaoe Bay that surround Ruth's facility are a perfect natural laboratory. The corals here are healthy now, but they were once devastated by raw sewage pumped into the bay and runoff from towns and farmlands. Almost 40 years ago, sewage was diverted out of the bay. The toughest corals recovered and grew, and life returned to the reef. But then, in the last few years, even these resilient reefs suffered severe bleaching events. documented by Ruth and her team. What she saw underwater and in photographs intrigued her.
What's so great is that the bleached part of the colony has completely recovered in an extremely short period of time.
2 coral colonies, side by side, one completely bleached, while the other was unscathed.
We don't really know much about recovery. We know a lot about bleaching.
For Ruth, this indicates that the ability to withstand bleaching, built-in resilience, may already exist in some corals. But can it be identified? Can it be enhanced? Can it help save the reef in another bleaching event as ocean waters heat up? Ruth's lab is running experiments to find out. One is conditioning, making hardier corals by subjecting them to periodic stress.
We're doing this conditioning work where we're really trying to elicit a memory in a coral by exposing it to stressful conditions that are really simulating the future warmer and more acidic ocean.
One way to do that is to move corals from one environment to another.
So what have we got here, right? Our work is trying to understand what happens to the biology when you move a coral from one environmental history to another.
These racks hold corals selected from this site, a reef inside Kanahoe Bay.
And these corals feed through a lot. These corals have traditionally experienced a lot of stress on raw sewage from the entire day, and a lot of corals died during that period of time. These corals have also gone through 2 back-to-back bleaching events.
And that's exactly what over half of the Great Barrier Reef has just been through. These are real survivors, subjected to warmer, murkier, sometimes polluted conditions in the shallow water. The light levels, chemistry, and temperature of the water are measured constantly. Data sent back to the lab from the buoy above. They'll move this coral to another reef in the bay with different conditions to observe how they react to the stress of rapid change, more current and greater fluctuations in temperature.
See over here? This is a coral that was bleached during the last bleaching event. You can see that this individual doing very well. It's fully recovered its color.
These hardy corals may hold the key to the reef's survival.
We think that these experiences is along the lines of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Unlike the Great Barrier Reef, Hawaiian reefs are built by just a few species of coral. If Ruth can crack the secret of conditioning, she might be able to plant the reef with conditioned corals after the next bleaching event.
It's great to dive another reef. I mean, we think of reefs as being this global phenomena, but every single reef I dive is different. And this one stood out as being relatively simple, beautiful, competitive, full of fish, but relatively simple in its species richness. And to me, the turning point here is I can imagine being able to restore a reef like this. But the really killer question from a biodiversity perspective is, could we even possibly restore something as complex biologically as the Great Barrier Reef, where you've got hundreds of species of coral competing in the same amount of space?
One solution to restoring the reef is to breed the toughest survivors together to make even hardier corals, supercorals.
So you raise the overall resilience of that system. You basically take a coral that's doing really well, you propagate it, and you plant it back on the same reef.
But most corals can only reproduce once a year. It's the only chance scientists have to selectively breed them. If they miss it, they have to wait another year for one of the most spectacular displays in nature: coral spawning. Many corals are hermaphrodites that release bundles of eggs and sperm in a single packet, all at the same time. Different species of coral spawn at different times of night, releasing billions of packets of sperm and egg in different colours and sizes. The packets are a feast for all kinds of animals on the reef. But that's part of this reproductive strategy. Predators can only eat a small portion of the overwhelming numbers of eggs and sperm released. The packets float to the surface, turning the ocean pink. Here, the bundles mix and break apart, and fertilization takes place, leaving tiny larval coral adrift in the ocean. After just a few days to a week, the coral embryo resembles a living grain of rice, called a planula. It can swim, sense light, and detect the chemical signature of the reef. The planula swims to the bottom and begins a surprisingly picky search for a suitable home. Then it attaches one end to the bottom and in just a matter of hours transforms into a tiny coral polyp about the size of a pinhead. Immediately, it begins to secrete the calcium carbonate base that will become its permanent home. Some baby coral are virtually clear, their white skeleton showing through. To survive and grow, they must take up an algal partner. Ruth believes that this might be the key moment to help some coral.
They are vacant when they are born, and now we can deliver and provide them with symbionts and hope that they take them up.
If algae that tolerates heat can be cultured in the lab, then introduced to baby corals or even to bleached coral on the reef, it might help them survive this period of intense ocean warming. But will that be enough?
So really all of this is predicated on the fact that we will at some point get our act together and cut carbon emissions, because ultimately no amount of assisted evolution is going to assist unless we do that. But in the meantime, we're thinking, how do we get the corals and the reefs through a really rough period? Is that right?
That's exactly it. Unless we mitigate climate change, it's a complete waste of time. But what we have is a scenario where the temperatures are rising, and we know that at 2050, almost all of the scenarios put the global temperature at about the same point. And that point is above the threshold for coral reefs. Now, what will happen is the temperature will continue to go up, and then through mitigation, will stabilize and come down. We need to get corals through that moment in time when it goes up before it comes down.
And so the fundamental question becomes, are we at risk of doing more damage in the meantime? Like, what could we possibly do in this assisted evolution that might reduce the capacity of reefs to get through this crisis?
Well, so I think that you know, I'm going to be really blunt. If we don't assist the system, we will have no reefs to damage through assisted evolution. And I think this is always the perspective that somehow we might introduce an invasive into a native population that might be doing well. But the native populations aren't doing well. Some things that I do will not work, and I'm okay with that. I'm quite prepared to fail, but I am not prepared to not try.
So much going through my head right now. A lot of it not things that I want to think about, but I'm forced to think about it by this impending catastrophe. In fact, this catastrophe that's happening right now with bleaching, global bleaching. Most of what I'm pondering is risk, and I know that sometimes when humans have tried to intervene, we've caused more damage and we haven't solved the initial problem. So there's this risk framework that I'm trying to toss up. Some of the techniques that Ruth has already developed could immediately be applied on the reef. And maybe the sooner we get into that, the sooner we prevent some of the catastrophic damage that's being done. It's just really hard to know when and where to essentially start playing God.
Earth's climate has changed dramatically over its long history. Could there be clues to the future of the Great Barrier Reef in its past? I'm back in Australia, heading to the University of Sydney to meet geoscientist Jodie Webster.
We're using multi-beam sonar to map the seafloor in exquisite detail. And it's allowing us to, for the first time, identify where the Great Barrier Reef has gone during periods of lower sea level and climate change.
So you're going back through time?
Exactly, going back through time.
These are remnants of reefs that flourished when sea levels were much lower.
During the last ice age, sea levels were approximately 120 metres lower than present. And so the shoreline was actually right out here. Right, so I call this the story of the life and death of the Great Barrier Reef through geologic time. The Earth has gone through major global climate changes, causing the Earth to sort of wax between ice age and not. And so the Great Barrier Reef has turned on and turned off. Turned on, turned off. On the bottom axis we have...
Jodie says the last ice age is a great example. Beginning about 125,000 years ago, the climate cooled. Seawater became locked in ice, and sea level fell dramatically. And coral followed the water. 20,000 years ago, it dropped to its lowest point. You can see this history in cores. Samples collected by drilling down through the reef structure.
That's a massive coral, isn't it?
Yeah, that's one of these classic brain corals. That's about 100 to 120, 125,000 years old, and that was growing probably quite happily for about 50 years. They grow about a centimetre a year. And then something quite amazing happened here, and you can just make out the brown discoloration, and that's a soil horizon.
So the reef was left high and dry?
Completely.
Right here.
Yeah, exactly. The Great Barrier Reef died and was wiped out in that place and left high and dry as sea level began to fall. Then global climates changed, it got warmer, sea level began to rise very rapidly, and then the modern Great Barrier Reef turned on again about 8.3 thousand years ago.
Changing sea level killed the last barrier reef and brought it back. Events that happened over huge timescales. But what about what's threatening the reef now? A temperature rise faster than ever before.
The last interglacial temperatures were higher than they are now, a degree or more than a degree.
But that reef had, I guess, thousands of years to get used to the warmer waters. We've observed a 1 degree change over a 100-year period. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about a change that took thousands of years.
Yes, that's right, more than 10,000 years.
Looking back through time is always useful. You get great perspective. And speaking to Jodie, I now realise the reef has come and gone several times throughout geological history. It's extremely sensitive to environmental conditions. But what we also see is that it's resilient. It's recolonised space and it's flourished again. albeit over periods of thousands of years. The real question is, can the Great Barrier Reef bounce back from a climate change event that's so comprehensive and so much faster than anything we've ever seen before?
If the reef is to survive, perhaps natural selection will choose those corals that can tolerate the extreme changes we're seeing now. Or, because the changes are happening so fast, perhaps we do need to intervene. Yet, from all I've learned, I'm still not sure what action to recommend to the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. And I need more information to decide. At the Australian Institute of Marine Science, or AIMS, researchers are using one of the most sophisticated environmental labs in the world in the race to find solutions.
I'm heading to AIMS, just outside of Townsville on the Queensland coast. AIMS is near the beach, but the reef itself lies 60 kilometres out to sea. And that's too far for the scientists to visit on a regular basis.
AIMS brings the reef to them with the National Sea Simulator, SeaSim. The SeaSim controls every aspect of over 3 million litres of seawater flowing through the facility every day. Light, temperature, salinity, acidity, even sediments and pollutants. These tanks hold corals collected from the Great Barrier Reef, but the water in each tank is different, set to match today's conditions and those predicted for the years 2050 and 2100.
Hi, Madeline.
Hi, Emma. This is this experiment that I told you about where we expose corals to predicted ocean conditions for the year 2050.
They're not happy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Madeline Van Oppen is a senior researcher here. Her focus is assisting evolution, work she's doing in parallel with Ruth Gates' efforts in Hawaii. Madeline is creating hybrids, new species that may be more resilient. And she's experimenting with the fundamental relationship between coral and its algae.
The reason I want to try and contribute to the persistence of coral reefs is that they are so important to the functioning of the world. I mean, they're very important ecosystems that sustain a high amount of biodiversity. We disturb this planet to such a great extent, and if we as scientists can do even a little bit to try and restore some of the things we have damaged, I think we should try all that is within our power.
For Madeline, saving reefs starts at the beginning of coral life. It's time critical. Most corals only spawn once a year, so if Madeline misses it, her experiments have to wait 12 months.
So you're actually waiting for that moment every year?
We do, yeah. We can reasonably predict when it will happen because it's related to the moon cycle.
Madeline tells me what happened last November during the most important week of the year for her research.
So were you successful in the spawning last year?
We were, yeah. We brought in quite a few different coral species and we were able to set up a number of hybrid crosses.
Madeline and her team check the tanks constantly for the crucial moment when new coral life begins.
It must be a hectic time.
It's really crazy because all these different coral species spawn at slightly different times, so those are very long nights.
When corals are ready to spawn, the packet of eggs and sperm bulges just inside the mouth of the coral. It's a race against time. To selectively breed the corals, Madeline needs to capture each colony's egg and sperm bundles before they fertilise. They isolate the ones that are ready and await nightfall.
Sounds like a risky business.
It is actually. It's very risky when you work with different species because sometimes they spawn on different nights. And so if they don't spawn on the same night, that's it for that year. We have to wait another year before we can run that experiment.
Coral can actually sense light, and bright light could disturb the coral. And if they don't spawn, it's a disaster for Madeline's work. So the team uses red light. Every few minutes, they check the coral. And then it starts. At first, a few packets drift upward. And then it's like an upside-down snowstorm. The team have to collect the packets before the eggs and sperm separate. Madeline hopes to create a new hybrid, a cross of two different species.
What happens if you make a hybrid is that you put two divergent genomes together into the one organism. And by doing that, you create new gene combinations and a new genetic diversity.
And those new corals may be better equipped to survive future, warmer and more acidic oceans.
So if you can make this work in the lab, if you can get heat-resistant corals,
Yep.
will it work in the field?
So we will have to test it in the field. A field trial is really critical. I'd like to do that in a location that is quite isolated in terms of ocean currents. So a reef that we know that won't send up an awful lot of larvae to surrounding reefs. There's very little risk for these new corals to spread across the Great Barrier Reef.
But right now, the big question for Madeline isn't how to restore reefs, it's is it even possible?
I'm going to pour these bundles into this...
And the most important step is to separate the eggs and sperm of each coral colony.
I'm just going to gently agitate.
So Madeline can choose which corals to cross. She swirls the bundles in a mesh bottom container. The eggs are trapped, while the water turns milky as the sperm slips through.
This is probably more than enough sperm already, so I'm going to just...
Now, Madeline must wait for another species of coral to spawn before she can crossbreed them. Outside at the tanks, another team is exploring a way to give Madeline more control over the breeding process.
I need to collect 5 mils of bundles over 5 mils of water. Not very much.
They're creating a bank of genetic material for artificial insemination in the future.
What I'm after is mostly the sperm that's located in these bundles. Then we freeze it in liquid nitrogen. And from there, it can be frozen and thawed with the sperm is still alive. And it can be used in fertilizations the same night, a year, 10 years, 100 years, whatever you need later. So what this is basically banking down some of the genetic diversity in case we continue to lose corals everywhere.
For Madeline, having a sperm bank of diverse corals on hand will make it hybrid species, using cryopreserved sperm when other coral species spawn.
So you're focusing on the sperm, not the eggs?
Yeah, so far we cannot successfully freeze the eggs, so they're no longer alive after the freezing process, but the sperm is very successful.
No one has yet mastered freezing coral eggs. But cryopreserving something else has exciting promise.
We've also started to freeze the algal symbionts of corals.
Madeline has successfully grown heat-tolerant algae, the coral symbiont, in the lab. Tonight, Madeline and her team are testing a radical idea. She'll freeze the heat-tolerant algae, then thaw it, and introduce it to coral. The question is, will coral larvae accept it?
How has it been going?
It's good. Just about ready to cryopreserve now.
Liquid nitrogen flash freezes the algal cells, the symbiodinium.
We're trying to freeze them really, really rapidly so that the liquid that they're in basically just sets. like a solid piece of glass.
The frozen algae is immediately thawed and introduced to dozens of coral larvae in a single drop of water. If they're accepted, it opens new possibilities for helping bleached corals on the reef.
How long do you think it will take for the larvae to take them up?
We're going to assess them after 2 days and then again after 4, so it'll give them a little bit of time to take up these cryopreserved Symbiont.
Then Madeline checks on other corals for signs of spawning.
Yeah, the other species is going to spawn too. It's setting. We've got lots of colonies isolated, so I think we're going to have hybrids tonight. It's very exciting.
In the lab, it's time to attempt a hybrid coral species.
So when we do this hybrid process, we do not actually know beforehand whether the offspring will be more resilient. That by chance you may end up with some traits, some characteristics that might be beneficial under climate change.
Millions of coral larvae are kept in constant circulation. In a few days, they'll be released into the climate-controlled tanks. But now, the team checks on the progress of the larvae exposed to heat-tolerant algae that's been frozen, then thawed.
So I think that they're infected. Ah, they're infected. That's really fantastic. That means we can now look at how that affects the temperature tolerance.
Under a microscope, it's clear the frozen, then thawed algae, the symbionts, have been absorbed by the coral larvae.
That's a big success because I guess one of our best hopes for building heat tolerance is through the symbionts.
I think, yes, making the symbionts more tolerant is probably the way to go. We can think about spraying the reef with symbionts, perhaps.
So because they're so small and so quick to culture, the idea of scaling up to a whole reef full of heat-tolerant symbionts is actually far more practical than planting baby corals.
That's right, yeah.
If large amounts of heat-tolerant algae can be cryopreserved and stored, they could be a first aid for bleached, starving reefs. Madeline sees promise for her new hybrid corals.
So we grew these under the ocean conditions predicted for the year 2050. And it's amazing. Generally, the hybrid corals survive better than the purebred corals. And you can see that really clearly here. In this left-hand lane, all of these corals are purebreds.
They're tiny.
Yeah, they're tiny. And these two rows are hybrids. And you can see that we have some really large colonies compared to the purebreds. I think it's quite amazing. There was no negative effect of hybridization.
So you're trying to essentially take advantage of something that would happen fairly rarely, but that you're speeding up the frequency of that process. Yeah, give them a fighting chance of getting through.
Exactly right.
From what Madeline's shown me, I can see how hybrid corals could preserve the structure of the reef, even as other species die off. The freight train of ocean warming is barreling towards us, and the reef, as we know it, is disappearing. The question I've been grappling with is this: to intervene or let nature take its course? Both have risks, big risks.
Letting the catastrophe unfold, we know that some corals will probably make it through, but we will lose the structure of the reef. If we artificially restore reefs by breeding hyper-resilient coral, we risk creating an uber species, and that outcompetes all of the rest.
I need to decide what to advise the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and I need to do it fast.
I hate to be blunt, but we really don't have much time to think through what is the perfect solution at this point. We're threatening everything on the reef, everything.
Doing that sort of selection in a laboratory, my opinion is the scale of that and the expense of that means it's really not going to make a big difference. It's a drop in the ocean.
I don't think the reef needs to have as many species as we see today to be a functional reef. But without the coral reef structure, there will not be any other species. So it's really critical that we save corals.
So, can science save a reef? I think the answer has to be no. Not the reef, not as we've known it. But while the climate is changing, we can't afford to sit back. Can science actually help us steer the reef through this period of massive climate change? I think the answer to that is yes. Assisting the evolution of 1 or 2 species of important reef-building corals may help us keep the structure of the reef. If we can perfect some of these techniques and scale them up, it may well be worth using out on the Great Barrier Reef, especially when the consequences of doing nothing outweigh the risks.
And that's what I've advised my colleagues at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. Now, for the first time, we're considering proposals to test new corals on the reef. And there's not a moment to lose.